This video is part of the Passport.js user authentication series. If you're just now finding this video, the playlist for that series is in the description below. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to configure the passport.jwt strategy. And like the passport local strategy that we did earlier in this series, it's going to follow a pretty similar structure. So just like we did in the passport local, or pretty much any passport strategy, we're going to need something called a verify callback. So in other words, when we're in our routes, so say we're in our login route and we pass in a passport.authenticate method, what that method is going to do is call the verify callback that we have defined in the passport configuration. So if we open up config passport.js, it's going to be defined right here. So whatever we define within these brackets is what is going to be called when we use the passport.authenticate method. As with any new package, let's go ahead and look at some of the documentation. So the documentation for passport.jwt, I have it pulled up right here. You could also go to strategies on the home page and click passport.jwt to find it. So the documentation, like most strategies, is not necessarily uniform. All these strategies are coded by different developers, so it's all based on how that developer is going to put it in there. So you can see here it's a little bit jumbled up, but it gives us most of what we need to know. The first thing that I'll draw your attention to is going to be right here, and you'll see that just like the passport local strategy, the passport middleware as like a framework is going to expect the same three responses. So if our callback returns some sort of error, whether it be a database error or an express application error, we pass in the done callback with the error parameter as the first parameter, and then false for the user object. Then if we successfully authenticate the user, we say that there's no error, and here's the user object, which will eventually be attached to the express request object. And then finally, if there is no error within our application, but there's also an invalid user, then we're going to say there's no error, but there's also no user. So these three responses to this verify callback is how Passport knows what to do. Alright, so now that we got that covered, let's look at some of the options that we're going to be dealing with when we're using the passport.jwt strategy. So as we know, we're going to call passport.use, and then we're going to pass in a new some sort of strategy. In this case, it's the JWT strategy, and then that strategy is usually going to take options first and then the verify callback. So those options here are going to be defined up here at the top, and I will note that most of these options are related to the JSONwebtoken NPM library. So if we open that up, here's the JSONwebtoken library. This is actually what the passport.jwt strategy is using to verify our JWT. So all of the options that you see here, so there's some examples. Here's the jwt.verify method. This is exactly what the passport.jwt middleware is using, and all this strategy is doing is passing in the token that it receives. It's going to pass in the secret or public key, so there's multiple ways that you can verify. We're going to be using the public key since we're using asymmetric cryptography. And then we have the options object, which is literally going to be just passed straight through to this method from the passport middleware. So you'll see down here we have all the options that we can put in here: algorithms, complete, issuer, ignore expiration. All of these you'll also see, well, not all of them, but you'll see most of them listed here in the strategy documentation. Now the way that we actually include these options is a little bit tricky, and I actually could not, based on this documentation, figure out how to get all of these options passed to the verify callback. So what I've done is just put together every single option that you could possibly ever need, and I've put it in a single options object. And then we'll kind of reduce to only the stuff that we need. Going back to our code, let me just paste in this like all-encompassing options object. And I might even leave this in the final implementation, just comment it out. But here is the full options object. If you were to pass in this, obviously you need to replace some of these things with valid values, but if you were to pass this in, it would be readable by the passport.jwt middleware. So you'll see at the bottom we have the JSON-webtoken options, and this is where it gets a little confusing, because here are some of those JSON-webtoken options that we saw in that libraries documentation, but there are also options from JSON-webtoken that are passed up here. And if you were to pass these down in the JSON-webtoken options, the passport.jwt middleware, as it's implemented, would not actually read them correctly. So it's really important that you put the options I have listed here exactly how you see them. If you see them in the JSON-webtoken option, they need to stay there. So that is the entire all-encompassing option object, but we don't actually need that. I'll go ahead and put this in the final branch of this repository, but I'm going to delete it out for right now, and we're only going to work on what we need. The very first thing we'll do, as with any module, is import it. So we need the passport.jwt strategy, and we're going to extract the strategy off that, so that's going to be a class, and then this extractJWT class, which is basically a little subclass that is going to give you options as to how you extract the JWT from the HTTP header. If you look at the documentation online, you'll see that this is detailed at the bottom. So in the section extracting the JWT from the request, this just has to do with that process where the server needs to know how and where that JWT is stored in the request. Usually it's going to be in the authorization HTTP header, but it isn't always there. So this gives you some options as to where you can find this. So we're going to just be using from auth header as bearer token. This is probably one of the more common ways to do it, but you could also pass it into like a post request body field. You could put it in a URL query param, and if you were to do that, you would use these different methods from this class. You could also write your own extractor function. So I know I mentioned earlier that you could put the JWT in a cookie, and this right here just gives kind of that example. This is how we would grab it from a cookie, and so you can kind of have some freedom to implement whatever you would like. So our options object is going to be pretty simple. Just going to replace this right here. And this is what we're working with. So this is the options object that we're going to need to implement the JWT strategy. First is what we just talked about. The extractJWT class comes with different methods for finding that JWT and parsing it. So we're going to use the from auth header as bearer token. So in other words, it's going to expect that we have our JWT sitting like this. So here's our authorization header, and then we're going to say bearer, and then a single space, and then here is where our token is going to sit. So it expects this exact syntax, and if you were to maybe take the space out or just delete the bearer portion completely, it's not going to be able to read it correctly. You'll see how that works a little bit later. The next thing is the secret or key property. And you can either pass in a symmetric key, which would just be a secret that you stored in an environment variable. But for us, since we're using the RS-256 algorithm to issue and verify JWTs, we're going to pass in our public key that we generated with that script right here. And we're reading that from the file system. It says path to key ID RSA pub. And the reason that we're passing in the public rather than the private is because what we're configuring right here is the verify piece of the JWT. So if you remember, we have the issuance and then the verification. With a digital signature, we sign the issuance with the private key, and then we verify the identity with the public key. So that's why we're passing in the public key, because passport is the verification step of this process. Then finally, we're just passing in the algorithms that it will accept, and we should be done with it. So that's our options object. Obviously, we didn't include half of the options that were available to us, but I just wanted you to know that those were available in case you were doing something a little bit different than me. Like I did with the passport local strategy, I'm going to kind of deconstruct this configuration so that you're not just looking at a big blob of callback functions and options and all that stuff. So we're going to keep it as modular as possible here. The first thing that we do, we have our options object already configured, but we need to use the JWT strategy right here. So we're going to say const strategy equals new JWT strategy. All right. So that is going to take two arguments, one being the options object that we defined right here, and two being a callback function, which is going to, it's already telling us what it expects. So it's going to take a payload and a done callback. All right, so that is the basic implementation right here. And then we're going to actually configure it by saying passport.use strategy. So again, this passport object is being provided from app.js. Then we're taking that object, we're saying use, so similar to a middleware, and then we're passing in the strategy, which has the options configuration and the callback function, or the verify callback, that we are about to implement. Within the callback, as I mentioned with the passport local strategy, the great thing about passport, and also the confusing part, is you don't have a specific way that you're required to verify an authentication. And in our case, we can use whatever database we want, we can use whatever code logic we want to do. Now, since we're using MongoDB, we'll just use the find one method on the user model. So we've imported this from our database configuration. So we'll just say user.findOne, and then we're going to pass in the ID. And where are we going to get this ID from? Well, if you remember from previously in this, I think it was in the first video, we talked about how the JWT payload, so the second part of a JWT, is going to have a subfield. Well, in our case, it has a subfield, and in many cases, it has a subfield that will include some information or unique identifier about the user. In our case, when we implement the register and login functions, or the routes, we're going to issue a JWT, and we're going to place the MongoDB database ID in the subfield. So here's our payload. This is in JavaScript object form. So we can literally just say payload.sub. And that's going to pass in the ID that we need to look up our user in the database. We will then use promise syntax to grab the user, and then we will catch any errors that happen. And if you remember, we need to pass in the error to the done callback if we and no user if there's an error within this operation. So the last thing we need to do is something in this area where we have access to the user that we just looked up. Now, if you were watching the Passport local strategy, you'll probably remember that in this area we were doing all sorts of stuff. We were verifying, using a crypto function. We were verifying the username and password. Well, in this JWT strategy, it is much, much simpler. We've already validated this JWT. So this strategy has already gone through the process of using the JSONwebtoken library to verify the JWT that it's received. So at this point, when we're sitting right here, we already know that our JWT is valid. So all we have to do is check if we found a user in the database, and if we did, we need to return it to Passport so that it can attach that to the request object. So we'll just say if there's a user, we will return done, and there's no error, but there is a user. Otherwise, we're going to return done, and we're going to say no error and no user. Excuse me, this is not null, this is going to expect false. So Passport expects to see either a user object or false. So that is the implementation that we need to do for this verify callback. It seems like nothing really is happening, but behind the scenes, the Passport JWT strategy is taking these options, it's grabbing that JWT from the authorization header, it's validating that JWT with the JSONwebtoken library. Then once it's validated it, it passes the payload object right here. Then we grab the ID of the user from the payload sub object, look it up in the database, return it to Passport, and then Passport attaches it to the request.user object within the Express framework. So that is all that we needed to do to implement passport.jwt. Now I would try this out in the browser and see if it's working so far, but the problem is we haven't issued any JWTs. So we could go generate a JWT or grab an example from online and see if it would work with this, but it never will because we have generated exactly 0 JWTs using the private key that we generated in this repository. So in other words, when Passport JWT strategy tries to verify the JWT we've included in the authorization header, it's going to reject absolutely everything because there is no JWT in existence right now that corresponds to this private key. So when we verify it with the public key, it's just going to reject it. So what we need to do is write some logic in our login route so that every time a user logs in, we're going to issue them a new JWT that is signed with the private key that we are using from this server. Then the Passport JWT middleware will use the public key that resides on this server and will successfully verify these newly issued JWTs. So to do this, we need to come to the routes. So we're in the routes users.js file. And the first thing that we'll need to do is the register function. So if a user is going to come to our application, they obviously need to first register. And basically what's going to happen in both of these routes is we're going to issue a JWT regardless. So the way that this flow is going to work is if a user comes to our application and has never been there before and registers, they're just going to provide their username and password. Then we're going to store that new user in the database and issue them a new JWT. And then we're just going to consider them logged in for as long as that JWT is valid. And then the login is also going to issue a new JWT, but it's just going to look up the existing user in the database and validate the username and password that user put in there when they registered. If you watch the Passport local strategy videos, you're going to be very familiar with what I'm about to paste in. So what we're doing here in the register function is we are taking the plain text password that the user has provided us with, and we're creating a salt and a hash based on that plain text password. We're just using some crypto utils. So if we go in lib, you'll notice that these two functions, valid password and gen password, are going to be the same exact generation and validation functions that we used with the passport local strategy. And so you might ask yourself for a second, well, wait a second, isn't this JWT, isn't this a JWT strategy? Like, why are we working with like username and passwords and all that kind of stuff? Well, you have to remember that the JWT is simply a result of a successful user authentication with a username and password. So whether you're using the passport local or passport-jwt authentication, you're always going to need to know how to store a password in the database and then verify it out of the database. I'm not going to go through that. If you wanted to really understand how this works, I do have a slide on that. Let me just pull it up really quickly. So here is the basic password validation process. Since I talked about it in the passport local strategy a lot, just go watch that video if this doesn't make sense. Otherwise, just read through this really quickly. Alright, so that's basically what's happening with the password generation and verification. And in the register function, we're doing part one of that. So we're going to create the salt and the hash and store those in the user record in the database. Then we'll save the user in the database and just return a success message as well as the user object. Now, I also mentioned that we're going to be issuing a JWT here, which we will do in 1 second, but I want to first look at the function that is creating that JWT. So we go to the bottom of the utils, and you see that we have exported this issueJWT function, which is defined here. And since the passport.jwt middleware is using the jsonwebtoken npm library, we might as well use the same library to issue the JWT. So what we're doing is we're taking in the user object that we have in the database. We are going to take the ID of that user in the database, and we are going to assign it to a variable here. We are going to say that we want this JWT to expire in 1 day. Usually you'd probably do this like 2 weeks or something, but we're just going to do 1 day for now. And then the payload of this JWT is going to be defined as the sub property will have the ID, as we talked about when we were configuring the passport object. And then the issued at will just be whatever timestamp is right now. Then we will sign the token, and we're going to do that using the .sign method of jsonwebtoken library. We're going to sign it with the private key. We imported this up here at the top. So here's the private key that we imported. And that private key corresponds to the public key that we're going to verify later with. Then we're going to pass in the expires in value and the algorithm that we plan to eventually verify it with and that we will sign it with. So once we've signed the token, we will return a token which has the bearer string at the beginning, and then the signed token, and then the expires in property. So we have this function that's going to issue a new JWT, signing it with the private key living on the server. And then we're going to come back to our users routes. And then in this success message, we're going to attach a token and then a expires in property. And to do this, we just need to, well, actually, we're going to want to do this down here because when we initially create the user, we don't have the ID that was stored in the database yet. So we need to come down here in the callback to get that ID. So we'll say the ID is equal to user.id, and then we are going to issue this JWT. So I think I've already included the utils library. So we've got the utils library up here. So we're going to say the JWT is equal to utils.issueJWT. Then we're going to pass in the user. And actually, I don't know why I did this right here. The function itself is going to grab that ID off of the user object. So all we have to do is pass in the user. And then if you remember, it returns us an object with a token and expires property. So we're just going to grab the jwt.token and jwt.expires. And there we go, we have a successful response. And once we have saved this user in the database after registering, the front end client will get this message right here. So let's do that really quickly. Let's run this, make sure that we don't have any errors going on. Looks like the database connected okay. And I'm going to open up Postman, which is just an HTTP request application. It's got a lot of other stuff. I should probably be giving it more credit than that. But let's go to register. I've already got the post request set up. And in the body, we're just going to require, I think it was just a username and password. So we'll say the username will be Zach. We'll say Zach JWT, just so that we can distinguish from the passport local strategy I was doing in a previous video. Then the password will be just 123, my default debugging password here. So I think that's all that we need for this request. Let me just check that really quick. Okay, so this is all we need. We should be able to run this and hopefully it works. Let's see what we got for the response. Looks like we had some issues, so let's go back and see what's going on. Oh, of course, we have the wrong route that we're using. I just said register. It's actually going to be, I think, users/register, or maybe even API/users. We'll find that out real quick. Come back to the code. Let's look at our index.js. Okay, so we're gonna, so it's the /users route is what we're gonna need. So come back to Postman, get rid of this API, we didn't include that. Now we should be able to send it and we get a successful response. So here's our response, success is true. Here's the user that we stored in the database, and we'll verify that in a second. And then here is the token and the expires in that we issued using the utils library that we wrote. All right, so this is what the front end is going to receive as a response, and then they're going to take this token and store it somewhere in local storage so that it can attach it to every single request in the future. Implementing the login post route is a little bit more complicated, but I'll post in the implementation, or paste in, not post, I'm looking at all these post requests. And what we're doing, it's pretty simple, but there's a lot of code here. So we'll start at the top. The first thing that we're doing is we're going to take the username that we received from the login form, whatever the user typed in, and we're going to look in our database for that username. If we, then we'll assume that we find the user and we populate it in this user property. We'll say first, if there's no user, so if this user in the database doesn't exist, maybe this person is trying to log in and they haven't even registered, we'll just return a 401 code with a message that says could not find the user. Pretty simple there. This next line, if you watch the passport local strategy, you'll understand this exactly. But if you didn't, what this is doing is using that valid password function. So up here, the validate password function, and it's basically going to check, okay, is the username that you just gave me and the password you just gave me, are they valid? So it's going to take that plain text password that the user just typed into the login form and validate it with the Node.js crypto library and that function that we already had defined. So this is going to either be true or false based on whether the user logged in successfully. And mind you, this is different from the JWT. Remember, we have not issued the JWT yet. We'll just assume that they're logged out. So if this is valid, we know, okay, this is a valid user. We need to give them a JWT that they can attach to all of their future requests so that they don't have to log in every single time. So here's our issued JWT. It's exactly how we issued it down here. And then we will attach that with the same exact response body that we did earlier. We also probably should just put in the user property here like we did in the register route. And then finally, if the user did not log in successfully, they gave us the wrong password or the wrong username, whatever, then we will return this response where it says you entered the wrong password. And it's just going to be a 401 response because that is like the unauthorized HTTP code. Alright, and then we're going to catch any errors, just put it through standard express middleware and catch it in our error handler. I don't even think we have one implemented for this, but that's kind of what that's going to do. Alright, so we've got both of our routes implemented, and let's come back to Postman. Just make sure that this is going to work. Alright, so we'll go to login, and let's just copy the body that we put for the register because it should be the same. So here's the user that I already have registered in our database. Here's the correct password for that user. Let's make sure that we have the right path here and click send, and we get a success is true, and we get the same exact response. Here is our JWT that we will store in the browser at some point. Alright, so we are done with the bulk of our work here. The last thing that we need to do is just test to see if our passport.jwt middleware is working correctly. So far, we haven't even tested the passport.jwt middleware. We've just been doing the basic username and password register and login and issuing the JWT. Alright, so coming back to VS Code, the way that we're going to test this is in this first route, which is the protected route. And we are going to pass in the passport middleware right here. So we'll say passport.authenticate, and then we're going to say that we want the JWT strategy, and we're going to pass in an object that says session false. And the reason that we do that, if you're familiar with the passport local strategy that we did in previous videos, we were using the passport session middleware to actually interact with the express session middleware. But we're not using this here because we're using JWTs, so we say that that's false. Alright, so what this is going to do is execute that verify callback, so this function right here, and if we successfully validate the JWT that is attached to the request, it should let us into this route, so we should be able to print something. Let's see if we can get in here. Alright, so we'll just say res.status200.json. Success will stay consistent here, is true. Message is going to be you are authorized. We are now ready to test this out. So let's go to Postman, and we'll come over to the protected route. Again, we need to put in that path, and here's where the magic comes in, but also kind of gets really confusing. We have to attach the JWT that this user owns to the authorization header. Now in Postman, you have the option to put it here in the authorization tab. You could just do bearer token and you put the token here, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to stick with basic HTTP headers to keep things simple. So we're going to use the authorization header, and then the value that we will pass in is that token that we received over when we registered or logged in. So we just logged in, so we're going to take this entire token, including the bearer portion, and we're going to copy that into the value right here. So this value, because it's in the authorization header, and because it says bearer with a space and then the token, which is exactly what the passport.jwt middleware is expecting, that middleware is going to take this value, it's going to run it through the verification function using the JSON-webtoken library, and hopefully authenticate us correctly. So we're just doing a GET request. Let's send it, and it says success true, you are authorized. So in this case, we just copied in the bearer token here, the JWT, in Postman. But obviously, if you're implementing an application, you're going to do this on your front-end client. So for example, Angular. And you're going to want a way to, you'll probably store it in local storage after you've been issued this, and then you will write some sort of logic to attach it to every request. But that's not the purpose of this video. This video is just to show you how to configure the passport.jwt strategy. So if you wanted to watch that, that'll be probably one of the next videos or something like that. But the last thing I wanted to do in this video is just kind of a quick recap to show you exactly how you're going to be using this. All right, so every route that you want to protect using JWT authentication, you're going to use this syntax right here. If you wanted to simplify it even further, you could probably write yourself a middleware that just calls this method, and then you only have to pass in like a couple letters. But if you wanted to, you can pass in this exact syntax every single time. Now, this is very different from the passport local strategy, because if you remember when we did that, if you watched that video, we only called the passport.authenticate method one time, and we called it in the login post route. And then after that, what we were doing to check whether this user was authenticated was saying if request.session.passport.user exist, or I think we had a shorthand method, if request.isAuthenticated, that's how we were validating whether a user was logged in. But since JWTs are by default stateless, we're not using sessions. We have to call this every single time so that the passport middleware can, grab the JWT that's included in the request and verify it. So it's pretty simple actually. This is all you're going to be using. Attach it to every request that you want to authenticate, and you could even come over to your passport verification and have some sort of different logics. You could say in this part of the body, you could say if user.admin, if you wanted to validate like an admin property or something. You can get pretty creative with it, but that is the basics of using the passport.jwt strategy. If you want to learn how to do this on the front end with an Angular application, be sure to continue on with this series. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, be sure to give it a like and subscribe.